Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We have done some pretty heavy lifting on this show before. We've tackled black holes, we've tackled crypto, but today feels a little different.
Yeah, it's a bit of a marathon today.
It is.
Yeah.
We aren't just looking at one event or, one historical figure. We are attempting to basically download the entire operating system of the modern world right into our brains.
It's the source code. That is really what we are dealing with here. We are looking at the machinery that built the West.
Exactly. We are tackling the AP European history curriculum, so that's roughly 1450 to the present. And I want to be clear right off the bat, if you are listening to this, because you have the exam coming up, do not panic.
Please no. That is the quickest way to fail history. And frankly, it's the quickest way to make a really boring conversation.
Right, we aren't going to just list dates until your eyes glaze over.
Yeah.
The goal here is to understand the machinery. We want to figure out how Europe went from being this backwater, fractured collection of feudal landlords to essentially conquering the globe,
Right.
then burning it all down in the 20th century and finally trying to reinvent itself.
It's a massive arc, and there is a guiding question that sort of hangs over all the source material we've pulled for this deep dive. How does a civilization rise to dominance through internal competition, and then how does that exact same competition become its undoing?
That tension is everything. And for you students listening, remember the exam is balanced. Every unit counts for roughly 10 to 15%. Do not skip the early stuff for the modern stuff. It all weighs the same.
That is such a good point. The guy painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is worth just as many points as the guy building the Berlin Wall. Every century matters.
So let's open the file on period 1. We're looking at 1450 to 1648. The headline in most textbooks is the Renaissance. But looking at the sources, it feels like the headline should actually be Europe wakes up and chooses violence.
That is a very fair assessment. But it is a specific kind of waking up. You have to understand where we are coming from. The medieval mindset pre-1450 was incredibly static. It was totally God-centered.
Meaning what? Practically. I mean, everyone was religious.
Meaning your life on Earth wasn't really the point. Earth was just a waiting room. It was a place of suffering, a test, and the real show started after you died. You didn't try to change society because the hierarchy was divinely ordained. Kings, nobles, peasants, that's just how God wanted it.
And then 1450 hits. What changes?
We get this intellectual explosion called humanism. And I want to be careful with this word because today it sounds like, being nice to people or humanitarianism.
Right, like doing charity work.
That is not what this is. Renaissance humanism is an intellectual shift from God-centered to human-centered. It starts in the Italian city-states. Florence, Venice, Milan, you have guys like Petrarch, who we call the father of humanism, literally digging through dusty old monastery libraries and finding letters from Cicero.
So they're reading the Romans and Greeks. They're looking backward.
They are looking backward to move forward. They read this stuff and realize, wait a minute, the ancients didn't hate life on Earth. They celebrated it. They built great cities. They debated politics. They wrote epic poetry. And this creates a crisis of confidence in the medieval worldview. They realize that humans have potential. They called it virtue.
And this isn't just about reading old books, right? It actually changes how they govern. This concept of civic humanism kept popping up in the source material.
This is crucial. Medieval education was for monks. It was theology. Civic humanism says education is for citizens. If you are going to run Florence, you need to understand rhetoric, history, and ethics. You need to be useful to the state.
So it shifts education from how to get to heaven to
how to run a city. Exactly.
which naturally leads us to the ultimate pragmatist, Machiavelli.
The bad boy of the Renaissance.
He writes The Prince. And I feel like everyone knows the adjective Machiavellian. It usually means manipulative, scheming. But based on the sources, was he actually evil or was he just observant?
He was brutally honest. That is the difference. Before Machiavelli, political books were mirrors for princes. They told you to be a good Christian, be kind, be just. Machiavelli looks around at Italian politics, which was just a snake pit of assassinations and betrayals, and says, if you act like a good Christian, you will be eaten alive.
So he argues that the ruler's job isn't to be good, it's to maintain the state.
Correct. For Machiavelli, virtue isn't moral goodness, it is effectiveness. It is the ability to impose your will on fortune. If you have to lie, cheat, or murder to keep the state stable, that is the moral thing to do. The ends justify the means. It is the complete separation of politics from ethics.
which is a thoroughly modern, completely secular idea. And we see this shift in the art, too. The visual evidence is usually the easiest way to see the mindset shift.
100%. Look at a medieval painting. It's flat. The figures look like paper dolls. The size of a person depends on their importance, not their physical distance from the viewer. Jesus is huge. Everyone else is tiny.
Then you look at Raphael's School of Athens.
And it is like putting on 3D glasses. You have geometric perspective. It is mathematical. It is rational. And look at the subject matter. It isn't Jesus and the apostles. It is Plato and Aristotle. It is celebrating human reason.
Or Michelangelo's David.
Which is the absolute ultimate statement of humanism. It is the human body not hidden in shame, but glorified. It is standing tall, ready to face a giant. It is the perfect metaphor for the era, humanity feeling its own power.
No, that's Italy. Sunny, wealthy, obsessed with the classics. But up north, the vibe is totally different.
Yeah.
The Northern Renaissance feels, I don't know, moodier.
It is much more pious. In Italy, the Renaissance was paid for by popes and merchants who wanted to show off. In the north, so Flanders, Germany, England, the humanists looked at the ancient texts, but they focused on the Bible and the early church fathers.
So instead of trying to be like Cicero, they're trying to be like Jesus.
Essentially, yes. This is Christian humanism. The big name you need to know here is Erasmus. He is the intellectual giant of the north. He writes, "In Praise of Folly," which is this biting satire making fun of corrupt monks and pompous bishops.
But he's not trying to burn the church down, right? He just wants to clean the windows, so to speak.
Exactly. He wants reform from within. There's a famous saying that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Erasmus wanted a smarter, cleaner church. He didn't plan on the chicken that hatched being a fire-breathing dragon that split Christianity in half.
We are definitely going to get to that dragon in a second. But first, we have to talk about the hardware update. The printing press, Gutenberg, 1450s.
The single most important technological development in this entire timeline, maybe in human history.
Why, though? I mean, I know books are good, but what does it actually break?
It breaks the monopoly on truth. Before the press, if you wanted a book, a monk had to hand copy it on sheepskin. A Bible cost as much as a manor house. Knowledge was rare and incredibly centralized. The church controlled what was written and who read it.
And suddenly, you can mass-produce ideas.
Speed and volume. You cannot burn books faster than a press can print them. This is what makes the Reformation possible. Without the press, Martin Luther is just another angry monk shouting in a forest. With the press, he is a viral sensation.
So we have the software, which is humanism, and the hardware, the printing press. Now let's look at the management. The new monarchies. This term comes up a lot in the review materials. How are they different from the old monarchs?
The old monarchs, the feudal kings, were just the biggest guy at the table. They had to ask their nobles for money. They had to ask their nobles for troops. They were relatively weak. The new monarchs, and we were talking about Henry VIII in England, Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, Louis XI in France, they changed the entire deal.
They stop asking.
They stop asking and start taking. They centralize taxation. They create professional armies so they don't depend on the nobles' knights. And they assert control over the church and their lands. They are building the skeleton of the modern state.
And they need a massive amount of money to do this. Which brings us to the side hustle that became the main event, exploration.
Side hustle is generous. It was a desperate gamble. Remember, in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottomans. The trade route to the east, to the spices and silk, is cut off or heavily taxed. Europe is totally cornered.
So they have to go west to get east.
Right. God, gold, and glory are the stated motives. But let's be real, it is mostly gold. They want the spices. Portugal goes around Africa. Spain goes west across the Atlantic.
And this shifts the whole center of gravity in Europe.
It is a massive shift. For thousands of years, the Mediterranean was the center of the world. Venice and Genoa were the absolute kings of commerce. Once Columbus hits the Americas, the power moves to the Atlantic states. London, Amsterdam, Lisbon, Seville. The Mediterranean becomes a lake. The Atlantic becomes the highway.
We really cannot glaze over what happened when they arrived, though. The Columbian Exchange.
It is the most significant biological event since the death of the dinosaurs. It is a biological swap. Europe sends horses, cows, pigs, and smallpox, measles, and flu. The Americas send corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco.
The potatoes part sounds kind of boring, but it's actually critical for Europe, isn't it?
It totally changes the calorie math. You can grow far more calories per acre with potatoes than grain. This leads to a massive population boom in Europe, but in the Americas, it is the Great Dying. 90% of the indigenous population is wiped out by disease within a century.
Which creates a labor shortage.
A horrific labor shortage. And the European solution was the transatlantic slave trade. They began importing enslaved people from Africa to work the sugar plantations and silver mines. It is the incredibly dark foundation of this new global economy.
And the economic theory driving all this is mercantilism. I always find this one tricky to define simply.
Think of the world as a pie. Mercantilists believe the pie was a fixed size. If I want a bigger slice, I have to take yours. Wealth is finite. So, a nation's goal is to hoard gold and silver. You want to export more than you import. And colonies exist for one reason only, to serve the mother country. You take their raw materials, you sell them finished goods, and you strictly forbid them from trading with anyone else.
So it's basically economic warfare.
Constant economic warfare.
Okay, so the state is getting stronger, the economy is going global, but then the soul of Europe cracks. Unit 2, the Age of Reformation.
The explosion. And it starts with a very simple problem. The Catholic Church had become a business.
The sale of indulgences.
Exactly. Pope Leo X needed money to build St. Peter's Basilica, which is beautiful, by the way, but he paid for it by selling get-out-of-purgatory free cards. It was blatant corruption, simony, pluralism, and you name it.
Enter Martin Luther, 1517, the 95 Theses.
Luther is a German monk, a theology professor, and he is just tormented by his own sin. He reads the Bible and has a massive breakthrough. He realizes that nothing he does can save him. No amount of fasting, no amount of charity, only faith.
Solified, faith alone.
Right, and sola scriptura, scripture alone. He says, if it is not in the Bible, I do not have to do it.
This sounds theological, but it is political dynamite.
Yeah.
Because if salvation is just between me and God,
then you don't need the Pope. You don't need the bishops. You don't need the priest to mediate for you. Luther calls it the priesthood of all believers. He democratizes access to God, and for the church hierarchy, that is an existential threat.
Then you have John Calvin coming in later. He's like the stricter, more organized version of Luther.
Calvin is the systematizer. He rules Geneva essentially like a theocracy. His big idea is predestination. God is all-knowing and all-powerful. Therefore, he has already decided who is saved, the elect, and who is damned.
Which sounds terrifying. It sounds like it would make you lazy. Like if I'm picked, I'm picked. Let me try.
But it actually had the exact opposite effect. It created immense anxiety. Am I one of the elect? So people started desperately looking for signs, and one sign was that you were hardworking and successful. This is the root of the Protestant work ethic, the idea that wealth and hard work are signs of God's favor, which obviously feeds right into early capitalism.
Meanwhile, in England, Henry VIII is doing his own thing.
The Anglican Reformation is the odd one out. It was not about theology. It was about an heir. Henry wanted a divorce. The Pope said no. So Henry said, fine, I am the Pope of England now.
The act of supremacy.
Yes. But notice he didn't change the doctrine much. The Church of England remained very Catholic in style. Bishops, robes, rituals, but just with the king at the top. This creates a really weird hybrid church that causes major problems in England for the next century.
The Catholic Church obviously didn't just take this lying down.
No. The Empire strikes back, the Catholic Counter-Reformation. They hold the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563.
Did they admit they were wrong about the corruption?
They admitted they were corrupt, but they fiercely insisted they were right on the theology. They cleaned up the indulgences, educated the priests, and stopped the partying bishops. But on doctrine, they doubled down. Pope is supreme. 7 sacraments, scripture and tradition, absolute zero compromise.
And they formed the Jesuits.
The Society of Jesus, Ignatius of Loyola. These guys were the intellectual shock troops of the Pope. They founded schools, they debated Protestants, and they went global as missionaries. They were incredibly effective at stopping the spread of Protestantism in places like Poland and southern Germany.
But they couldn't stop the violence. We move into the wars of religion. This period from 1560 to 1648 is just a complete bloodbath.
It is brutal. You have neighbors literally killing neighbors. In France, it's the Catholics versus the Huguenots, which are French Calvinists. It culminates in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestants are butchered at a wedding.
But this chaos actually births a new kind of politician. The politic.
This is a vital key term for the exam. A politique is a ruler who puts the survival of the state above religious purity. Henry IV of France is the perfect example. He was a Protestant leader, but to become king of France, which was mostly Catholic, he converts.
Paris is worth a mass.
Exactly. He sells out his faith to buy peace. But then he issues the Edict of Nantes, which gives Protestants the right to exist. It is the beginning of religious tolerance, not because they were nice, but because they were just tired of the bleeding.
And then we get the big one. The final boss of religious wars. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648.
The most destructive conflict in Europe prior to World War I. It starts in the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically Germany. It starts over religion, literally with the defenestration of Prague, where Protestant nobles throw Catholic officials out of a castle window.
They survived, though, right?
They fell 70 feet into a pile of manure. The Catholics said angels caught them. The Protestants said it was the horse poop. But it triggers a massive continental war.
And this war evolves. It starts as Catholics versus Protestants, but it gets weird.
It turns entirely political. You see France, a Catholic country, entering the war on the side of the Protestants.
Why would they do that? That makes no sense religiously.
Cardinal Richelieu. He is the French chief minister. He hates Protestants, but he hates the Habsburgs, who rule Spain and Austria even more. He sees a chance to break French rivals, so state interest beats religious loyalty, raison d'etat.
And it ends in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. This is a massive, bold text date for you studying. Why 1648?
Westphalia is the birthday of the modern international system. It kills the idea of a universal Christendom ruled by the Pope. Instead, it recognizes the sovereignty of states.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It means whoever rules the territory decides the religion and the laws. The Pope cannot intervene in your internal affairs. Religion recedes as a cause for war, and the balance of power takes over. It recognizes that independent states, not the church, are the primary actors in the world.
So that perfectly closes the book on period 1. The cultural rebirth and global expansion laid the foundation, but religious unity collapsed, leading directly to modern state sovereignty.
Precisely. The religious fracture necessitated the strong state.
Which takes us right into period 2, 1648 to 1815. The age of absolutism, enlightenment, and revolution. And right away in Unit 3, we see these new sovereign states trying to figure out how to run themselves. Two very different business models emerge.
Absolutism versus constitutionalism.
Let's start with absolutism. This is the I'm the boss period model.
And the poster boy is Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. He inherits a France that had been torn apart by those religious wars and noble rebellions called the Fronde. He decides, never again.
L'État, c'est moi. I am the state.
He centralizes everything, and his greatest weapon wasn't an army, it was a building, Versailles.
A golden cage.
Exactly. He forces the high nobility to live there part of the year. He turns them from dangerous warlords into domestic servants. He creates this elaborate court etiquette where nobles are literally fighting over who gets to hold the king's shirt while he gets dressed.
Sounds kind of ridiculous.
It was brilliant. If you are worried about whether the king smiled at you at breakfast, you are not plotting a rebellion back in your home province. It completely domesticated the aristocracy. And we see guys like Peter the Great in Russia doing something similar, westernizing Russia, forcing nobles to shave their beards, creating the table of ranks to control them.
Meanwhile, across the channel, England looks at that absolute model and says, hard pass.
England goes the other way, but it was incredibly messy. They had the English Civil War in the 1640s. James I and Charles I tried to be absolutists, and Parliament literally chopped Charles's head off.
That sends a pretty strong message to future kings.
It does. They try a republic under Oliver Cromwell, which was basically a military dictatorship with no fun allowed. They even banned Christmas. That fails. They bring the king back in the Restoration, but the tension between king and parliament is still there.
Until 1688, the Glorious Revolution.
The bloodless coup. Parliament invites William and Mary from the Netherlands to take the throne on the strict condition that they sign a contract.
The Bill of Rights, 1689.
This is the game changer. It says the king cannot raise taxes or suspend laws without Parliament's consent. It establishes constitutional monarchy. The law rules over the king. This sets England on a path towards stability and eventually democracy, while France is doubling down on rigidity.
And speaking of the Dutch, we really can't ignore them here. The Dutch Republic in the 1600s is this weird anomaly.
A Dutch golden age. It is a republic in an age of kings. It is dominated by merchants, not nobles. They are religiously tolerant, not because they are inherently nice, but because intolerance is terrible for business.
And they are rich.
Filthy rich. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, They basically invented the stock market. They controlled the spice trade. They proved you did not need a divinely appointed king to be a superpower. You just needed good credit and a strong navy.
There's also this underlying economic context during this time, the agricultural revolution.
Right, the seed drill, crop rotation, it creates a massive food surplus, which equals a population explosion. States are getting stronger, bigger, and more centralized.
So while the politicians are fighting over who runs the state, the intellectuals in Unit 4 are rethinking how the universe works, the scientific revolution.
This is the massive shift from Aristotle said it to I can mathematically prove it. Empirical reasoning.
It starts with the stars, Copernicus.
1543. He proposes heliocentrism. The Earth is not the center of the universe, the sun is. It sounds minor to us today, but it shattered the crystal spheres of medieval cosmology. If the church was wrong about the layout of the universe, what else were they completely wrong about?
Then Galileo builds a telescope and sees moons orbiting Jupiter.
Which proves not everything orbits the Earth. The church puts him on trial, forces him to recant, but the cat is out of the bag. Observation beats tradition. Bacon gives us the inductive method. Descartes gives us the deductive method.
And Newton ties it all together.
Isaac Newton, Principia Mathematica. He invents calculus to explain physics. Universal gravitation. He shows that the universe is not a mysterious place run by spirits. It is a giant clock. It follows mathematical laws. It is predictable. It is rational.
And that profound confidence that the world is a machine we can understand and fix spills over into politics. This leads us directly to the Enlightenment, the age of reason.
If Newton explains the laws of gravity, John Locke wants to explain the laws of society.
Locke argues that we have natural rights, life, liberty, and property. He says we aren't born sinful, we are born as a tabula rasa, a blank slate. We are shaped by our environment.
Which is a direct threat to monarchy. Because if kings aren't appointed by God, and if people are shaped by education and environment,
Then you can build a better society by changing the government.
exactly. You have Voltaire fighting for religious toleration and free speech. He pushes deism, the idea of God as a clockmaker who built the universe but doesn't interfere. Montesquieu looks at the British system and says, hey, this separation of powers thing works. Rousseau argues, for the social contract, that government only exists because the people agree to it, guided by the general will.
These ideas are circulating in the coffee houses and the salons. They are dangerous. They are reshaping governance and society in theory.
They are acid to the old regime. Some monarchs try to surf the wave, the enlightened absolutists. Frederick the Great of Prussia calls himself the first servant of the state. He hangs out with Voltaire, he promotes education, he tolerates different religions. Joseph II in Austria does the same.
But they don't give up power.
Never. They use Enlightenment ideas to make their states more efficient.
Unit 5, the system is too rigid to bend, so it breaks. The French Revolution.
The main event: conflict, crisis, and reaction.
The causes are a perfect storm. You have the long-term Enlightenment ideas we just unpacked, questioning tradition. You have the short-term crisis of financial collapse from war debt, largely from the Anglo-French global rivalry and helping the Americans, and you have terrible harvests.
France was broke. And the tax system, the three estates, was totally broken. The first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobles, paid almost nothing. The third estate, everybody else, from rich merchants to poor peasants, paid everything.
It was unsustainable. In 1789, the king, Louis XVI, is forced to call the Estates General to ask for money. And the third estate basically says, we represent 97% of the nation. We are the nation.
They form the National Assembly, they take the tennis court oath, swearing not to leave until they have a constitution.
And the people of Paris get involved. July 14, 1789, storming of the Bastille. This is the moment the revolution gets bloody.
But the early phase, the liberal phase from 1789 to 1791, is actually quite hopeful. They write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen,
which is pure Locke and Rousseau. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Their goal is a constitutional monarchy. They want to be like England.
So why does it go off the rails? Why do we get the guillotine?
Fear.
Exactly. The king tries to flee and gets caught. Austria and Prussia threaten to invade to restore the king. The revolutionaries panic. They think there are spies and traitors everywhere. The Jacobins, the radicals, take over.
Enter Robespierre. The radical phase.
Yeah.
1792 to 1794.
The incorruptible. He heads the Committee of Public Safety. He believes that to save the Republic of Virtue, you have to kill the enemies of the state. The reign of terror.
They chop off the king's head, they
Mm.
chop off the queen's head,
Yeah.
and then they start chopping off each other's heads.
It is total cultural revolution. They try to rewrite reality, de-Christianization. They create a new calendar starting at year 1. They replace God with the cult of the supreme being. They give us the metric system. It was an attempt to use reason to completely restart civilization from scratch.
But it eats itself. Robespierre is executed. The Directory takes over, which is corrupt and inefficient. And the country is exhausted. They are looking for a savior, someone to restore order.
Enter the little corporal, Napoleon Bonaparte,
Mm.
1799 to 1815.
The ultimate synthesis question. Did he save the revolution or kill it?
That is the classic essay question. He is the synthesis. He takes power in a coup. He eventually crowns himself emperor. So politically, he destroys liberty. He kills the republic.
But socially.
But he keeps the equality. The Napoleonic Code, it rationalizes the laws. No more special privileges for nobles. You rise based on merit, not birth. He solidifies the social gains of the revolution while acting like an absolute monarch.
And he's a military genius. He exports the revolution to Europe through conquest.
And here's the profound irony. Wherever his armies go, they abolish feudalism, they awaken the middle class, but they also wake up nationalism.
People start saying, we don't want to be French subjects, we want to be German, we want to be Italian.
Exactly. Napoleon plants the seeds of his own destruction. Nationalism is born in opposition to him. The Spaniards fight a brutal guerrilla war. The Russians burn their own country rather than let him conquer it. He loses his grand army in the Russian winter of 1812.
And finally, he is defeated for good at Waterloo in 1815. The kings of Europe gather at the Congress of Vienna to clean up the mess.
Led by Metternich of Austria. Their goal is to hit undo. They want to put the legitimate monarchs back on the thrones, restore the borders, and crush these revolutionary ideas. They want a balance of power so that no single country can ever dominate Europe like France just did.
The concert of Europe. And in a way, they succeed. They prevent a major Europe-wide war for almost a century.
They create peace between the great powers, yes, but they cannot put the toothpaste back in the tube. Revolution destroyed absolutism in the minds of the people. The ideas of liberalism and nationalism are out there, and the romantic reaction is emphasizing emotion over reason. Plus, the industrial engines that will power the next century are already starting to smoke in England.
Which perfectly sets the stage for period 3, 1815 to 1914. The age of industry, nationalism, and imperial competition.
This is where the modern world really takes its final shape. Unit 6, industrialization and its effects.
It seems to happen in 2 distinct waves, right?
Correct. The first industrial revolution, roughly 1750 to 1830, is centered in Britain. It's all about textiles, steam engines, and iron. Britain becomes the workshop of the world. The Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851 is basically their victory lap.
And then the second industrial revolution.
Roughly 1870 to 1914. This is steel, chemicals, electricity, and petroleum. And the leader changes. It isn't just Britain anymore. Germany and the U.S. catch up and start to overtake them.
Then the social transformations from this are seismic. We see massive urbanization.
The move from the farm to the factory, people are flooding into cities like Manchester and Liverpool. The living conditions are horrific at first. Cholera, overcrowding, zero sanitation. Edwin Chadwick starts a public health movement, building sewers.
Which creates a totally new class structure.
Yes. The old structure was nobles versus peasants based on land. The new structure is the bourgeoisie, the middle-class owners of capital, versus the proletariat, the wage workers. It changes family structure, too, creating distinct gender roles like the cult of domesticity for the middle class, while working-class women are in the factories.
And this intense social inequality births the isms of the 19th century, ideological responses to industrialization.
Exactly. You have liberalism represented by the middle class. They want free markets, Adam Smith style, and voting rights, but usually only for property owners.
Then you have conservatism.
Metternich's crew, trying to hold back the tide, defending tradition and the church.
And then the new challenger, socialism.
The ultimate critique of capitalism. It starts with utopian socialists, but then Karl Marx drops the hammer with the Communist Manifesto in 1848. He calls for the workers to unite and overthrow the owners. He frames all of history purely as class struggle.
And 1848 is a crazy year, the revolutions of 1848.
It is often called the turning point, where history failed to turn. Almost every capital in Europe explodes in revolution. Paris, Vienna, Berlin. It is a messy mix of liberals wanting constitutions and nationalists wanting independence.
But they all fail.
They fail because the revolutionaries are divided. The middle-class liberals get terrified of the radical socialist workers and run back to the conservatives for protection. So the old order survives, but it is cracked. States realize they have to start intervening.
Industrial power is transforming society and politics. Which brings us to Unit 7, 19th century political developments. Nationalism finally wins.
The map of Europe gets completely redrawn. The unification of Italy and Germany.
Italy's a more romantic story, right?
Yeah.
Cavour is the brain, Garibaldi is the sword. But Germany is the massive game changer.
Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, he realizes that the speeches and resolutions of 1848 were a mistake. He uses realpolitik. Politics based on cold power and pragmatism, not ideals. He explicitly says the great questions of the day will be decided by blood and iron.
He fights 3 wars to unify Germany.
He is a master diplomat. He fights Denmark, then Austria, and finally France. The Franco-Prussian War in 1870 is the key. He tricks France into declaring war, smashes them, and then, in the ultimate power move, proclaims the new German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles.
That is a serious grudge that France is going to hold on to.
Oh, they will hold on to it tightly until 1914. But more importantly, a unified Germany absolutely destroys the balance of power established in 1815. Suddenly, there is a massive industrial and military superpower right in the middle of Europe. It destabilizes everything.
While the map is changing, the intellectual certainty of the Enlightenment is starting to fracture. We call this modernism.
Yes. The 19th century started with such immense optimism. Science and reason will solve everything. But by the end, you have intellectual uncertainty everywhere. Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species,
which challenges the religious narrative entirely. We aren't special creations, we are evolved.
Right. And worse, people wildly misapply his biological ideas to society. Social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest applied to races and nations. It becomes a pseudo-scientific justification for racism and imperialism.
Then you have Freud,
who shatters the rational view of humanity. He tells us we aren't even rational actors. We are driven by subconscious desires and repressed trauma.
And Einstein comes along and says even time and space aren't absolute. Relativity.
The Newtonian rational foundation of the universe is shaking. But despite this deep internal anxiety, Europe decides to project its power outward aggressively. New imperialism from 1880 to 1914.
A scramble for Africa. They hold the Berlin Conference in 1884 to carve it up.
Europe goes from controlling small coastal trading posts to conquering nearly the entire African continent. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remain independent.
What drove this sudden land grab?
It was a mix. Economic necessity was huge. They needed captive markets and raw materials for the Second Industrial Revolution. But it was also strategic rivalry. I need to take this land so Germany or Britain cannot have it. Think of the Suez Canal. And it was ideological, that toxic mix of social Darwinism and the white man's burden.
And the technology finally made deep conquest possible.
The Maxim machine guns, steamships that could go up rivers, quinine to treat malaria. It was a brutal mismatch. But this imperialism massively increases the tension back in Europe. They are fighting over colonies, they are forming rigid alliance systems, and they are building massive navies.
Industrial nationalism plus imperial rivalry equals global tension. Which brings us to the cliff edge. 1914 is not a random date. It is the culmination of 19th century forces.
Precisely. It brings us to period 4, 1914 to the present. Crisis, total war, and global reinvention.
Unit 8. 20th century global conflicts. We arrive at World War I.
The Great War. It was the direct result of nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and alliances. The dominoes were perfectly set.
And the spark is the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo.
A localized conflict between Austria and Serbia becomes a global slaughterhouse because of the secret treaties.
And this introduces a critical concept for the AP exam: total war.
Total war means the total erasure of the line between civilian and soldier. The government takes complete control of the economy to produce shells and guns. Women enter the factories en masse. Propaganda is weaponized to dehumanize the enemy. It consumes the entire society.
And the human cost is staggering.
Millions dead in trench warfare, a generation wiped out. And when it finally ends in 1918, the peace settlement, the Treaty of Versailles, is an utter disaster.
Why did it fail so badly? Why didn't it bring lasting peace?
Because it was built on vengeance, not stability. France and Britain wanted to punish Germany. They forced Germany to accept war guilt, to pay massive unpayable reparations, and to shrink their military to almost nothing. It humiliated Germany without actually destroying its potential to rebuild power. It practically guaranteed a desire for revenge.
It also redrew the map again.
The Russian, Austrian, and Ottoman empires collapsed. We get new successor states in the East, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, but they are fragile. And in the colonies, the Africans and Asians who fought and bled for Europe expected self-determination. They didn't get it. They were ignored.
We also have the Russian Revolution happening right at the end of the war, pulling them out and establishing the Soviet Union. Then comes the interwar period. We have the Roaring '20s, but then the Great Depression hits in 1929.
The economic collapse is the nail in the coffin for those fragile post-war democracies. People are starving. They completely lose faith in capitalism and liberal democracy. When people are desperate, they want a strong man to fix it.
Enter totalitarianism.
In Italy, you have Mussolini inventing fascism, hyper-nationalism, anti-communism, the state over the individual. In Germany, Hitler and the Nazis take that fascism and add a violently racist biological component to it.
And in the Soviet Union.
Stalin, communism. He is industrializing Russia at breakneck speed with his 5-year plans and collectivization of agriculture, but at a horrific human cost. Famines, the purge of dissenters, the Gulag system.
And the Western democracies, Britain and France, just watch Hitler violate the treaty over and over. Appeasement.
They are completely traumatized by World War I. They will do anything to avoid another war. So they give Hitler what he wants, the Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland. But you cannot appease fascism. It requires constant expansion.
So World War II begins in 1939. Unchecked aggression leads to global catastrophe.
It is war on a scale never seen before. It is a war of annihilation. Nazi Germany isn't just trying to conquer territory. They are trying to fundamentally reshape the racial demographics of Europe.
The Holocaust.
The industrialized genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others. Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents. It is the darkest moment in European history. It is the ultimate perversion of the machinery we've been talking about. They use bureaucracy, technology, and efficiency, all the things the West prided itself on, to commit mass murder.
It completely broke the moral confidence of Europe. The total collapse of that 19th century optimism.
Completely. We see the rise of existentialism post-war. The idea that God is dead and we have to create our own meaning in an absurd universe. Because by 1945, Europe is physically and morally in ruins. The old powers are shattered.
Which leads us into Unit 9, the Cold War in contemporary Europe. The world is now divided between two new superpowers, the US and the USSR.
Europe shifts from global dominance to being the chessboard. The Iron Curtain descends. It is a bipolar world order, NATO in the West versus the Warsaw Pact in the East, held in check by nuclear deterrence.
But the economic recovery in Western Europe is miraculous, driven largely by the Marshall Plan.
The U.S. pumps billions of dollars in economic aid to rebuild Western Europe. Why? Primarily to prevent them from becoming desperate enough to vote for communism. And it works brilliantly. You get the economic miracle in West Germany and France.
But while they are rebuilding at home, Europe is losing its grip abroad. Decolonization.
Europe, completely exhausted by 2 world wars, loses its empires. India, Africa, Southeast Asia fight for and gain independence. Sometimes it's peaceful, often it's bloody, like the French in Algeria. Europe is forced to turn inward.
And in that turning inward, they make a truly radical decision. The reinvention. European integration.
The logic is revolutionary but simple. If you bind the economies of France and Germany together, making them dependent on each other for coal and steel, war becomes materially impossible. It starts with the European coal and steel community.
Which eventually evolves into the European Economic Community and finally the European Union.
Exactly. The EU, the euro currency, the free movement of people across borders. It is a massive experiment in preventing war through economic integration.
In a post-war society, changes dramatically too. We get the welfare state.
Cradle-to-grave social security, universal health care. It is a heavy burden on state budgets, but it's a new social contract designed to prevent the extreme poverty that led to fascism in the 30s.
We also see major social transformations. Feminism.
Simone de Beauvoir writes, "The second sex. Women fight for and gain reproductive rights, greater access to higher education, and increased participation in the workforce."
And eventually, the Cold War order cracks. The fall of communism.
1989. The Berlin Wall comes down. The Soviet Union officially dissolves in 1991. Europe is theoretically whole and free again.
But history doesn't just end. We face new, contemporary challenges. Globalization.
Europe becomes deeply integrated into a globalized system. We see massive migration into Europe, guest workers initially and later refugees, change in the demographics and sparking political friction. We have environmental challenges giving rise to green parties, and the technological transformation of the internet age.
So if we synthesize this entire arc, this 500-year deep dive, how do we get here?
Let's trace the machinery. In 1450, the Renaissance builds intellectual independence, but the Reformation fractures religious unity.
By 1648, to handle that chaos, absolutism centralizes power and builds sovereign states.
Then the Enlightenment empowers reason, which sparks the French Revolution and destroys absolute rule.
By 1815, that reason leads to industrialization, which totally transforms society and fuels powerful nationalism.
That intense nationalism and industrial imperialism create the perfect storm for World War in 1914. Total war reshapes global power entirely.
The Cold War reorganizes a shattered Europe into two camps.
And finally, globalization and the European Union redefine what sovereignty even means today. Europe created the modern world, then nearly destroyed it through its own internal competition, and ultimately had to reinvent itself.
It is an unbelievable story. Europe is no longer the global military hegemon, but it is this fascinating center of soft power and economic integration. And that leaves us with a really provocative final thought to mull over.
The tension between national sovereignty and European unity. We see it with Brexit.
Right. Europe invented the modern nation-state in 1648 at the Peace of Westphalia. And now, with the EU, are they trying to be the first to move completely beyond the nation-state?
It is the great political experiment of our time. Can you be post-national?
It's something to think about. For all the learners out there, remember to use the specific illustrative examples we discussed today. The Crystal Palace, Versailles, the Berlin Conference. Those are pure gold for your AP essays. Know the broad themes, but use the specific evidence.
And remember that history is interconnected. One period logically creates the next. Keep asking why.
Thank you for taking this massive deep dive with us. We will catch you on the next one.